everyone. I'm just very quickly going to introduce the next group. We are going to have the artist Rafael Lozano Hemmer, who creates interactive public installations at the intersection of architecture, technology, and performance. He has a piece right now at the Science Museum here, the Science and Industry Museum, called Atmospheric Memory, which you should absolutely check out while you're here for the festival. He'll be in conversation about that piece and about speech and computing in the age of AI with Professor Verena Rieser, Professor of Conversational Artificial Intelligence at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, where she leads the Natural Language Processing Lab and is affiliated with a number of high-tech interaction labs, and Professor Sophie Scott, a neuroscientist and the Deputy Director of the Institute for Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London, where she's also a Wellcome Senior Trust Fellow. Her research investigates the cognitive neurosciences of voices, speech, and laughter. I want to welcome them to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and welcome to this wonderful panel discussion. As Giancho said, the context for today's discussion is partly Rafael's extraordinary installation, Atmospheric Memory, which has one more day to go, in an incredible temporary building that we've built on the site of the Science Museum. And I would absolutely urge you, if you haven't seen it, to try and get there, but Rafa's going to talk a little bit more about it as well today. It's also, I think the other context is also really the incredible development of AI voice technologies. You know, old voice technologies like the telephone, the radio, had a truly kind of momentous impact on the course of social and political history. But new AI-driven smart speakers, which appear to be in everyone's home, over 100 million of them sold by the end of 2018, seem to represent a kind of real shift in voice technologies, because those technologies are no longer intermediaries. We communicate with them, not just through them. So there's lots of big ideas to discuss in today's panel. I'm going to ask you with about 15 minutes to go to start asking questions as well, so please get your thinking caps on. But I'm going to start with Rafa and ask him to talk about atmospheric memory, some of the ideas behind atmospheric memory, and what Charles Babbage would have made of Alexa.
Thank you so much. I just want to say how exciting the panel was. I wish that we just heard. I wish it was another hour of them. It was amazing. I am here presenting a project called Atmospheric Memory. I'm delighted to be here with you. It's based on a very specific writing of Charles Babbage, the inventor of the calculator and the computer, which says the following. 1837, Babbage said that as we speak, we create a pattern turbulence in the air coming from our mouths. And he wondered if we had a computer that was so sophisticated that we could calculate the motion of the molecules and rewind them, that we could recreate the voices of anybody who's spoken in the past. So to Charles Babbage, the atmosphere was a vast library that contained all the voices, all the promises, all the vows unredeemed of people in the past. And he asks, whose voice would we want to hear? Long lost loved ones, perhaps the voices of extinct languages, or in a particularly important part of that text, he talks about finding evidence of crime. So he says slave owners are getting away with murder, but all of their deeds are being recorded in the atmosphere, and they will have their comeuppance. So taking as a starting point this idea of total recollection in the atmosphere, we're presenting an artwork that has 15 contemporary, interactive, technological pieces, some using surveillance, some using AI, some using robotics, that discuss the issue of permanent recollection. This is the analytical engine. We actually have the world's first programmable computer that famously Ada Lovelace first wrote code for. It's here in Manchester right now on view, only for one more day. It's free. You can go see that one, even if you don't see my work, at the 1830 warehouse of the Science Museum. So I started working with the breath and with voice with this piece. I'm doing the volume down. This is, I was at the Havana Biennial, and my friends told me, bring something very small. The smallest, think of the thing that I could imagine is a breath. So we asked Omara Portuondo to breathe into this brown paper bag. And then she's a singer for Buena Vista Social Club. And we connected her breath onto this bespoke respirator that basically inflates and deflates a brown paper bag 10,000 times a day. It's a strange kind of biometric portrait, which of course is ridiculous. I'm an artist, so I make completely useless things. This project will be on view in the National Museum of Music of Cuba, so that when Omara Portuondo dies, you'll be able to visit the last breath of Omara Portuondo. Here in Manchester, we have a different portrait, is that of American composer Pauline Oliveros. I've long been interested by this turbulence that Babbage described. In Spanish, we say the word hálito. Hálito is the air that comes out of your mouth when you speak, is represented in codices, but also in medieval times. So we worked with NYU and Georgia Tech to create a system of laser tomography that could actually measure the density of the breath as you spoke, the hálito. And with photogrammetry, we took all these slices of the air that was expelled as you spoke, and we created the first 3D printed speech bubble. So this is an actual word that fits in your hand. I like it because it's like a projectile. And this is the first sentence, which is also being shown at atmospheric memory. So it's a full sentence. It says, au clair de la lune. Long been interested by the fact that 180 years after Babbage, what is atmospheric memory today is in fact, on the one hand, the accumulation of toxic levels of carbon dioxide. We are at 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide. No human has ever breathed this levels of carbon dioxide concentrations. So on the subject of automation and industrialization that Babbage championed, that has led to a real record, a register in the atmosphere of our human activity that of course is leading to climate change. So I'm very interested in asphyxiation as a way to evoke the questions of the commons. This machine here, not on view in atmospheric, but it's an important machine. It's an invitation for the public to go into a sealed, hermetic chamber to breathe the air that has already been breathed by everybody before you. It's a really disgusting artwork. I would never go into it, but it's basically a chamber, a decompression chamber. The clean air goes away, and then once the clean air is gone, you're invited to enter the main area where you can sit and breathe with 3 warnings. One is contagion, so there's no filtering. You're sharing bacteria and viruses and pheromones and all kinds of airborne pollutants. Second is panic, because to get out, you need to also go through the decompression chamber. And the third is asphyxiation, because we only have 10 days of oxygen in the chamber. We ask you to be there no more than 10 minutes. The vicious air comes out of these tubing systems, and then there's a system of bellows inspired by 17th century organs that create a movement in 61 brown paper bags, the same as the Omara Portuondo ones, to visualize this collective air happening. On the subject of why, as an artist that works with media art, I find this as an important perversion, is that oftentimes we, as media artists, we talk about participation as something that's empowering, something that is going to give you agency, and you're going to be able to personalize the system and so on. Well, in this piece, if you participate too much, you die. And crucially, your presence in the chamber is making the air more toxic for future participants. So it's really a question about us being the bubble boy. Remember the suppressed immune system person? Well, we are the bubble boy. There's 8 billion people living in this shared atmosphere. So the piece kind of goes into a dark area. Because the other experts are experts in voice, I'll show 2 more artworks. One is inspired by the Mexican poets estridentistas. They were the nerds of their time in the 1920s. The poets were the pioneers of radio broadcast in Mexico. They had the Manifesto for Antenna Man, and they believed that radio frequencies was a new public space that would allow artists to emancipate the public. How wrong they were. But one of the poems is called Magna Voz, and it talks about a technology that can amplify a human voice to an urban scale. for the massacre, the memorial for the massacre of students in Mexico in 1968, 10 days before the Olympics were to happen in Mexico City. About 300 students were massacred, peaceful activists, and then the blood was cleaned and nobody could speak about this for about 30 years. And then I was invited by the university to make a memorial to remember this loss. So what we did is we created a megaphone that from the site of the massacre converted your voice to light. And as you spoke, let's just...
La represión que vivimos en este momento, los mártires, todas aquellas personas que lucharon.
So her voice is being flashed by a 10,000-watt searchlight that goes from the site of the massacre to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the voice gets sent by other 3 searchlights around Mexico City. The voice is also being converted into FM radio so that anybody who tunes into 96.1 FM can listen live to what the voices are saying, unmoderated and uncensored. So the idea is to create a way for survivors of the massacre, for students, for neighbors, rappers, poets, manifestos, to speak through this technology and have their voice be visible. I'm very interested in this idea of the visibility of sound. And throughout that time, I just want to tell you, it was very moving. When you open up a mic like this, people participate in ways that are out of control. I don't have time to talk about that, but please look at it. Last piece I want to show you is about technology. So in the studio, we work routinely with face detection and face recognition algorithms, which, as you know, thanks to AI, have jumped in the quality of the tracking that they do. This here is a mirror where you see yourself with basically face analysis that compares you to a database of 43 students that were kidnapped by the Mexican government, 17 to 21-year-olds in Ayotzinapa, Iguala, in Guerrero. As you look at this work, the computer matches you to all the different students, and it pulls out who looks like you the most. It says you look most like Martín Getsemani Garcia, but then it gives you a level of confidence. It says we are 17% that you are this person. Therefore, result, student not found. And the idea is that these technologies of surveillance, of tracking, this digital atmosphere that now brings it back to Babbage. We are now in Babbage's dream of a total recollection. There is, as we know, all kinds of devices that are recording our every move, our every voice. And the question with works like this is how can we misuse those technologies of control to create systems of empathy and systems of solidarity, and also crucially to understand that we may be next in the apparatus of repression.
Thank you.
So
that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. Verena, many of Babbage's ideas are being kind of brought up to date, really, with your work. Just tell us a bit more about your work and research into conversational AI and what conversational AI systems are, why they're useful.
Right, so when we say conversational AI, right, what we really mean is any sort of agent you can talk to, any sort of artificial agent which has the ability to listen to what you say, understand what these words actually mean, assign some meaning to these words, then have a big think and come up with an answer, again, in natural language. Sometimes it's multimodal, sometimes these systems can also, show you a picture or something like that. So this ability to actually, not only recognize the words, but also get some meaning from them and interpret that meaning is often solved with what we call machine learning. So we learn that from large amounts of data. So one example, for example, when you go into atmospheric memories, you can speak into a microphone and it recognizes your words and displays them on I think it's a cloud display. So that underlying technology is called speech recognition, and it's trained on a lot of different voices because we all speak differently, right? So that immense variation we all have, male voices, female voices, children, which are especially hard to recognize, people with accents like me, they still get recognized training on these large amounts of data sets, right? And this is also why speech recognition is so good these days, because we've got companies like Amazon and Google, they have access to this amount of data. So I started working in this area about 15 years ago, and we always struggled with speech recognition. We couldn't get past speech recognition. We only had very simple systems, which, you know, you had to say 1, 2, and which option do you want, 1, 2, and 3, and you were lucky if you got, you know, one of these numbers right. Now we are way past this stage. For those of you who have Amazon Alexa at home, I'm always amazed how good speech recognition is. So now we are past speech recognition. Now these systems suddenly become what we almost perceive intelligent, right? So they answer back in meaningful ways. And what I experienced is more and more people are actually looking to have a social conversation with these systems, which I personally find very surprising, because in my mind, people are using it to set timers and you know, listening to the radio or something like that. But over the past 2 years, myself and my university team, we were involved in a challenge, international challenge called the Amazon Alexa Prize. So Amazon invites university teams to do cutting-edge science for them for very little money, only the fame, and access to a lot of data. So what we get to put our system on the Amazon Alexas in the whole of the US and collect data. So our system gets to speak to the US public. And the challenge is to make a system which can talk about pretty much anything. So this is what we call in AI the holy grail, right? So have a system which pretends to understand and be able to respond to anything from, you know, politics to what you did on the weekend, to finding a recipe for brownies, anything you want. So that's why we took on the challenge. And what really stood out for me when looking at all this real data, which, by the way, not a lot of universities get access to, because usually you only have, you know, your limited lab experiments. So what really stood out was how many people really want to chat with these systems. So thinking they're somehow social, right? To want to have a social conversation with these systems. Which I found very surprising. I think a lot of these people were also children. We didn't have that information, but the type of topics the children users brought up made me think those probably are children. Which obviously raises a lot of ethical implications. You know, our children talking to these devices sitting in our home, who knows what they all record. There were all these, you know, scare stories in the media about, you know, having recorded a conversation and sent away with your private information in it. So the way, at least we're told, these systems work is that they have a keyword, right? And this keyword, the listening out for the keyword is done locally. So one of these speech recognition systems sits on your local device, which you buy, and always listens out to that specific keyword. And then once this keyword is recognized, then the cloud speech recognizer, so the more complex speech recognizer, kicks in and listens to what you say. So obviously there's a lot of potential for like mishearing the keyword. So I've got, you know, several of those devices at home myself, and I often wonder, why is Alexa or Google Home now listening to me? I didn't say the keyword, so there's obviously a lot of room for misrecognition, and then a lot of room for, you know, data sharing where you didn't intend to share your data. So that's with respect to privacy, and I think what's really interesting for me is that I think we are now with these, you know, voice assistants and voice interfaces at the stage which, as we heard from the previous panel, the World Wide Web used to be a couple of years ago, meaning it's a brand new technology which we can still shape, but it is already controlled by these big companies. And specifically because it's bound to a hardware, which we all sort of buy in and get into our homes, you already have to make the decision, do I get a Google Home, do I get an Alexa? There isn't something like, the internet where you can just basically have a free choice.
And I think it's really interesting what you were saying about people suddenly starting to have a more emotional engagement with these systems. I was reading that if you go onto Google Assistant and say I'm lonely, what you get is the AI pulling from its memory bank the words "I wish I had arms so I could give you a hug," which is kind of weirdly creepy and disturbing, but also it shows there's a kind of increasing intersection between our emotional lives and AI. I'm just wondering how you think these technologies might start to shape our emotional lives.
Yeah, so this is really, really interesting. So that was also one of the things I noticed from looking at the data is the emotional engagement from the users, and not only the positive emotional engagement. So you probably have all noticed that all of these assistants, almost all of them, are female. So what we got, an unsurprising amount, is abuse directed to that female character. So not only people saying, "Oh, you stupid thing, you don't recognize me," but actually, verbal abuse in the lines of sexually harassing Alexa, right? Which to me was a dark side, which I didn't expect. And that obviously brings up the question of why does it have to be a female and why does it have to be human after all? Why does it have to incorporate a female persona, which then pretends to even wanting to have arms to hug you? There is in AI and computer science in general, there's this discussion of anthropomorphism, like why or should we make machines pretend to have feelings? Mislead us into thinking they are not only intelligent, but also have an emotion. Similarly, I often get the argument when I say, "Oh, you've got all this abuse data," people say, "Well, why do you care? It's not a sentient being, so if people want to abuse Alexa, why is there a problem?" I think the problem is that we represent her as a woman assistant, which is subservient. And in the long run, these voices become more and more human-like, and people interact with these female voices, which they sort of bark commands at like a female servant living in their house. And I think that's just the wrong, metaphor. We've chosen to actually make this as a female house slave, basically. And again, this was a choice by these big companies. I think it started out with Siri. Siri was the first home assistant. She was clearly a woman. And then the other big companies followed, equally making them mostly female. Now you can actually change the voice. So you have a choice setting it to male. All except Alexa, I think she only can be female, but the default is still a female voice.
Sophie, it's probably a good time to start thinking, as we enter this age of AI voice technology, actually to think about the human again and really what the kind of uniquely human dimension of voice and sound. You were talking earlier in the green room about how sound is our social sense. It would just be really interesting to hear a bit more about that. What's the significance of sound and voice to us as our species?
So, sound is really weird. It's one of the things that if you find throughout nature, if an animal wants to raise the alarm, it makes a sound because it works in the dark and it works around corners and it can happen behind you. And it's fast. That air turbulence that Rafael is capturing in his picture, that's not the sound. The sound is being transmitted by the vibrations of the air molecules, and it's quick. And it gets to your... It only is working because we're connected by some kind of material. The molecules have got to be vibrating in something. In space, no one can hear you scream, but in fact, it couldn't hear you laugh or play the guitar either because you need that air. But as long as you're connected by the air or water or something, you'll get those sounds. And you can't close your ears, you can't ignore it. So it's terrifically useful sound. But it does seem to have some very interesting sort of specific phenomena building on that for communication. So it is the primary social communication for humans remains talking to each other, although we could be doing everything in a text-based way if we want to. Sound seems to be the way that we choose to do this. And in fact, you can hear before you're born, the last 3 months of in utero, you are learning, if your ears are working, about the sounds around you, and you're learning from that. So you learn your mother's voice, you learn properties of the rhythm and the music of the language that you're going to be exposed to once you're born. So we come into the world knowing about sound, connected to the world in some sort of continuous way before we were born by sound, and it's why singing seems to be so important to humans. So another absolute universal for humans is singing to newborn infants, and even in there's examples in the deaf literature of women who are deaf but have a hearing baby and who will sing to that baby because that's how important it is to babies. So it seems to have this very important kind of meaning and connection right from when we're first born. And it becomes about language and speech. I mean, that's what we tend to emphasize when we, you know, in my field of neuroscience, we look at people talking and say, well, there's spoken language, and language is this incredibly complex phenomena that doesn't seem to have easy parallels anywhere else in the animal kingdom. But it's also still speech, and it's sound, and it's music. And the human voice is as much a musical instrument as a manifestation of the computational power of language. And it never really loses that. And it does seem to be a very important kind of, more than the sum of its parts, really, for communication. So it's not just a way of transmitting information to each other in these social interactions. We're social primates. And in fact, there's an argument that says one of the reasons humans evolved spoken language was so that we could do the social interactions that all other primates manage by physically grooming each other. Now, if you were a Gallardo baboon, if you weren't asleep or eating or sorting out issues to do, shall we say, with reproduction, you spend most of your day grooming each other, because that's how you know where you are in the social hierarchy. Who grooms you, who you get to groom, that sort of determines where you are in the world of Gallardo baboons. And in fact, that's all other primates. And it takes a huge amount of time. They spend hours doing it. And one of the arguments Robin Dunbar makes is the fact that humans have been able to make our social networks much more efficient by not having to spend several hours a day picking through each other's hair for nits, although I'm up for that. If anybody wants to curry favour with me, I'm definitely, I think we've lost a lot. We can much more efficiently maintain social contacts by just very quickly speaking to each other. And that's giving us that. So if you imagine walking down the street and you saw someone you knew, you have a cut-off between people you stop and say hello to, people you might just wave to, and people you think, you know, I can probably safely pretend I haven't seen them. And that's your network. That's your social network. So in fact, speech and talking to each other for the hearing world is the primary way that we're actually maintaining this. And it really matters to us. So for example, we're now coming to understand that, with very good evidence, that the single biggest preventative cause or risk factor for dementia is uncorrected hearing loss in adulthood. Because what happens is you stop talking to people if it's hard to understand what they're saying, and it does become difficult if you have hearing loss. And if you don't get hearing aids and you don't use those hearing aids, what you see is people start to withdraw from contact with other people. And that is fundamentally bad for your brain. You need that kind of contact. You need that social network, and talking is the main way for doing it. So I think it is really interesting that the kind of the physicality of sound and meaning, and it's embedding us in the world in a way that obviously is hugely important for understanding each other, but even just for kind of getting about your environment, you rely on sound a lot for actually a sense of place and the other things going on around you. We're very sensitive to different properties of acoustic environments, and although we don't necessarily pay attention to it in the same way we do often for describing our visual contexts, it really does matter to us. So sound kind of grounds us. It's grounding us to our place, and it's grounding us to our social network in an incredibly important way.
And how much of the human voice is human because it comes from the body? I mean, you get lots of AI-generated voice, like Alexa and Siri, but it clearly has limitations. I mean, it'd be good to just talk about the limitations, and I guess the importance of the humanity of the voice emanating from our bodies.
So really, I'm going to say something that's so profoundly dull, it's kind of ridiculous. So just give me a pass on this. But if I don't say anything, you don't know anything about what my voice is like. I'm going to have to do something to have a voice. Now, I can transmit information about myself visually without doing anything. You could get it from a photograph of me. You have a sculpture of me. You don't need me to do anything to get information from my face and my body. I have to speak for you to know anything about my voice. And actually, that means that sound and voice is always really odd because it's an action. It's more like describing gait than it is describing a face. And it gives us this really weird thing. So voices are always absolutely embodied in the physical structure that we have. So because I'm using my body to make my voice, it's affected by my height, my weight, my age. It's also affected by my sex. So I've got one of the main reasons that I have a different voice to Mark is that I am biologically female, he is biologically male, and biologically men have different voices that start to change noticeably in adolescence because men have got this a visible Adam's apple, which means they have what's called a secondary descent of the larynx. They've got a longer pipe to make the sounds of speech. So you've got all that going on. You've got a physicality, and that's why emotion affects our voice. You can have a poker face. It's really hard to have a poker voice because if you're really upset or you're really frightened, your body changes, and then your voice will change on top of that. And then you've got this whole other layer of contextual things and sort of highly variable things. So people speak differently depending on where they are, who they want to be, who they're with, where they're from, where they learnt to speak. So all this other kind of stuff layered on top of that, all that social meaning. So you've got this incredibly embodied social phenomena. And that's what voices are. They're this weird sort of evanescent tell about all sorts of different aspects of ourselves that are grounded partly in the body and also partly in who we want to be. We speak in a way that reflects how people want to hear us. Now, that is really hard to build into AI. And I think it's very, very interesting. Like a friend of mine, he was one of the people that auditioned to be the male voice of Siri, and he had to go to San Francisco and spend like days just saying different phrases in a very reliable way. And that's what you can. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that how this sort of endless search for some kind of mythical dream neutral voice that male or female somehow will be kind of entirely acceptable to people. Whereas, in fact, there's no such thing as a neutral voice. All of us have an accent. All of us are producing a thing that's completely weighted with social information. And there'll be someone in the room who'll listen to anyone talking and think, oh, my God, I cannot bear how she talks or he talks. Because that's just your reaction to it. There was a woman on The Apprentice a few years ago. I kind of talk like that. And she was like, oh, Sir Alan, I didn't know you'd like how she looked at me. And I was going, good God, look at that woman. Look how she speaks. That's just terrible. She's letting the whole side down. And, of course, I'm telling you more about myself with that reaction than anything about her. She's free to do what she damn well likes with her voice. That I'm saying is she doesn't even try to sound like me. It's almost as if, can you imagine? She possibly doesn't even want to sound like this. And that, and that will be true for everyone. Absolutely everybody will have. So I think sometimes we get too hung up on that, and we should just. There is really. Put your hand up if you like the sound of your own voice when it's recorded. Put your hand up if you dislike. Excellent, excellent. Put your hand up if you dislike the sound of your own voice when it's recorded. Okay, now that's most people. In fact, there is a study showing if you present people with loads of voices to rate, you're just rating how much you like them, and you're critical they don't know this, you hide examples of their own voice in there, but they must not know it's their voice. When you do that, people tend to rate their own voice as one of the nicest. Because you talk the way you want to. That voice is expressing all sorts of things that you think is quite fine. And as long as you're tricked into thinking it's you, then you'll like it. So in fact, probably we should have voice assistants that sound like us. As long as we don't know that, we'll be very happy with it.
Rafa, quite a lot of your work has certainly engaged with ideas of surveillance, as you've talked about, and it's clear that the business model of pushing those AI voice assistants out is the hardware is being pushed out at a loss. In an attempt that I guess by Google and Amazon to colonize our personal space and to colonize our data. Where's that leading us to?
Well, I mean, it's leading us into a naturalization, right? So we are seeing this now as an extension of ourselves, as something that we cannot sort of live without. But one of the things that I find really interesting on the discussion of the voice and the embodied voice is the question of the visible voice. So I'm aware of enormous swaths of society that feel that their voice does not count, that somehow they're voiceless. And I think that one of the interesting interesting challenges is to think about, well, that world of the digital voice is a bubble, and that outside of that bubble there is an enormous number of voices that need to be heard. Not that I have a solution for this problem, but I'm always thinking about this, kind of power asymmetry between those of us who have the privilege to have this kind of devices, and then the vast majority of people who do not have the resources, and if they had the resources, we'd accelerate climate change even more. And so from my perspective, it's something that just needs to be put in the perspective of the really important question of whether this atmosphere is wanting to kill us. And when you think about the atmosphere not just as a site for the exchange of poetry and songs, which of course it is, and you breathe it, it's also the thing that connects us, right? My private air now becomes public, and now you're breathing it. But crucially, I'm from Mexico City. I just developed late onset asthma, and thousands of people die each year in Mexico because of toxic air. So I guess what I'm trying to say is one must develop a very critical understanding of this, not as being neutral, natural, invisible, but a fundamental battleground for the survival of our planet. And so on the subject of these artificial voices, I think it adds to that cacophony of privilege that so many of us live under.
We have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to open it out for some questions. And we've got some roving mics somewhere, so there's a couple of hands going up. Very good. In the middle.
Hi. Oh, that's a bit loud. Hi. This is mainly towards Verena, but I'd like to also hear the other two panelists, if they want to expand. But so you were talking about how, Amazon and your work wants to deal with how to make the AIs like Siri and Alexa go into conversation with people. So talk about anything political or anything of that sort. So my question is, in order to do so, surely you have to prescribe to your AI of choice some sort of political bias or some sort of, even within the context of how they sound, already that sort of betrays the maker's biases or that maker's sort of preferences. For example, in Alexa being the subservient female. So I was wondering, from a practical standpoint, who do you think and who currently does choose these things, and how do we go into the future and to avoid these kind of putting up showing the biases and trying to make it as unbiased as unprejudiced as possible?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. So there's a very recent report by the UNESCO actually who tries to uncover who's actually designing these personas, right? And the conclusion is we don't really know. So there are these creative teams within Amazon, Google, who actually come up with very concrete personas in mind. I think, Amazon Alexa, so Alexa is a woman in her 20s. She went to college, she studied a specific subject. So they have actually a very, very concrete young woman in mind. And it's, dreamed up by some people, probably white men in Silicon Valley, right? And that's also why we get these, frankly, quite shocking replies to, for example, sexual harassment. So recently there was an article in the news saying, well, if you actually insult Alexa and co, you'll actually get inappropriate behavior, even flirting behavior, responding back. So the UNESCO report is entitled, "I blush if I could." So that's when you call Alexa the B word, then that's what she'd say. So the problem is that we've got a very small group of people who form that personality, who come up with hard-coded answers of what these examples should be. So similar problems are if you talk about politics, right? So that was something we actually became very conscious about when we entered the Amazon Alexa Challenge. A lot of people wanted to talk about Trump. And whatever our bot said, they took it personal and took it for the, accused us that we were either for Trump or against Trump. So we couldn't get it right? So we ended up actually avoiding the topic altogether. But obviously another feature of these voice assistants is that they pick information for you, right? So if you ask a question, they will find a news source and give you the information. So if you ask about news, they could either give you an article from The Guardian or they could go to Breitbart, right? So that's a choice which they can make. And how this choice is made is not apparent to us. It's not transparent. So similarly, if you ask for a piece of information, if you go to a browser, you'll see a whole history, and you make your choice. You click on that link which you think, even though maybe they're ranked, you're free to scroll down and make a choice further down the list of what you think is a trusted source, for example. So with these voice assistants, you don't make that choice. You basically get the answer which is presented for you, and that's relating back to the previous panel discussion, where these companies actually start controlling the information you receive, and even more so through speech.
Thank you. I think we had one question over here.
Hello, can you hear me? I've been a bit curious recently, in an age when we kind of let companies like Google effectively read all of our email, know who all of our friends are, they know where we live, they know where we work, they know our travel habits and things like that. People are still very sensitive about voice control and voice devices, and the whole "they must be listening" thing comes up quite a lot. And it actually seems like quite a clumsy device to have a microphone when you've already got a pretty clear image of what who people are by just their other kind of data habits. Why do you think it is that people are still really sensitive to voice as opposed to things like email and GPS and things like that?
Sophie?
I mean, I suspect part of it is the way that we use voices. If it's primarily, the dominant mode for, the most common thing people do when they talk to each other is gossip. There's a myth out there that women gossip more than men. They don't. Everybody gossips. I think the only difference is men sometimes get to call it networking. But we rely very heavily on that as being a private thing. In fact, one of the ways that you know where you are in a social network is who will gossip with you and the extent to which they will share private information with you. That's not a neutral thing. You don't share private information with everybody, and the more close the relationship, the more you'll do that. So if you throw that under a bus by having something that's listening to all of it and potentially could be sharing it, that's like a fundamental basis of what you're doing with those voices to start with that is being overruled. And I think that's one of the reasons why it feels like a genuine like an actual outrage almost to what you can normally associate with the rules of using your voice in that way.
Rafa?
I just wanted to mention that in relation to the socialization that happens through voice sharing, it occurs to me that these digital voices speak to the symptom of a society of loneliness, of people that are sort of segmented, separated, they live in their bubble, and they're living a very lonely life. So there is a composer in the US, 1971, he wrote a composition called Coming Together. It's Frederick Chevsky. It's a great Marxist composer. He's still alive. And the beauty of theater, and since we're in a performing arts festival, is of people coming together that have disparate experiences and that you get to share a reality and then you speak to each other. I think that's like our solution in respect to a world where you segment and you speak to an inanimate object connected to a corporate server is theater.
In kind of two question time type.
I wanted people to get excited over theatre. Let's get excited about theatre.
I think we've got 1 minute left, and in two kind of question time mode, I'm just going to ask one last question to each of the panel, and this relates really to your work in atmospheric memory, Rafa, and Babbage's kind of theory, which is, if each of you could recapture one lost voice, who would you like to hear?
Okay, can I turn that around slightly? Because actually you can't hear. One of the things that's really odd about voices is they change all the time. I mean, everybody's voice changes over their lifetime. Accents change. Even the Queen speaks very differently. And that can be really hard to recapture. So growing up when I did, I heard the Beatles are sounding like the Beatles. And if I could do anything, I would like to hear the Beatles for the first time with the ears of somebody who'd never heard someone sing pop music with a Liverpudlian accent. Because it was genuinely shocking. It was working class, it was northern, and it was really shocking to people. And I don't want to hear the voices for the first time. I'd want to hear it and all the context of that meaning. And that would just be amazing. And of course, that's always true. I remember the Sex Pistols as sounding genuinely shocking. And that was the context I have access to, so I'd like to take that back to the Beatles.
I guess as a computer scientist, I ought to say something like Ada Lovelace. But I was thinking about this question. We had a warning that this question would come. And listening to the last panel session, which I really thoroughly enjoyed, I was thinking, actually, I really want to know about all the unheard voices. All the women, for example, who helped building these systems, helped building the internet, helped men, flying to the moon. So it's a common theme in computer science that women are not heard. And I think Rafael's idea would actually bring all those voices back. So it's a history which is not selective in terms of, only the rich and powerful gets heard and documented, but actually everybody would be able to have a place in history, and I find that idea very beautiful.
I would probably choose Mexican poet El Nigromante, who's a politician who in 1821 said that God is dead, the natural beings are developed through their own means. He said this 10 years before Darwin and 40 before Nietzsche.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, but please thank our panel, Sophie, Verena, and Rafael.
I was gonna